Some phantoms are not born of the grave, but of ambition cloaked in faith. It begins with a trembling solicitor's tale of a ruined tower on the Norfolk coast, where lights flicker, bells toll without hands, and fear itself becomes the deadliest weapon. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. Let us walk with Holmes into the Black Tower, where every shadow conceals a secret, and every secret brings us closer to the truth. It was upon a bleak autumn morning, when the fog clung thickly about the chimneys, and the air hung damp with the scent of rain, that I found myself once again in our sitting room at Baker Street. The fire had sunk low upon the hearth, and the atmosphere, though not uncheerful, carried a gravity that matched the dreariness beyond our windows. Holmes sat cross-legged in his armchair, the long, thin fingers of his right hand drumming gently upon the armrest, while his keen eyes, half veiled, seemed to gaze through the very walls of our lodgings. For my part, I had been perusing the columns of the Times, though my mind wandered continually to the silence of my companion. There were moments when he withdrew so profoundly into his own reflections that I felt like an intruder upon a world impenetrable to ordinary men. Yet on such days, experience had taught me, a sudden event might rouse him from his languor into the most extraordinary activity. So it proved upon this occasion, for even as the bells of a distant church tolled the half-hour, our landlady's footfall was heard upon the stair, and the uncertain tones of a visitor's voice followed in her wake. I laid aside my newspaper, sensing instinctively that Holmes would soon be summoned into action. The dullness of the morning was about to be dispelled by the arrival of a case worthy of his singular genius. Mrs. Hudson ushered into our chamber a gentleman whose entire bearing proclaimed anxiety. He was of middle years. Seat lies near a ruin long dreaded by our people, the Black Tower. For many weeks she has been subjected to strange disturbances. Lights gleam within the tower at hours when no soul could be present. Servants whisper of shadows passing across its battlements, and now one of her householders disappeared altogether. Holmes's eyes flickered momentarily, though he uttered no word. He merely inclined his head, as if weighing each syllable with care, while I felt already that some sinister thread was drawing us toward an extraordinary inquiry. Mr. Fenton's voice lowered as he spoke the name of the ruin, as though the very syllables carried dread. The Black Tower, he said, has long been the subject of fearful tales among the villagers. Built in the 12th century, it served for centuries as a prison, and men say that many who were confined there met their deaths in darkness and cruelty. Its walls are thick with moss, its battlements crumbling, and yet it seems to cast a shadow that stretches beyond stone and mortar. He paused, glancing uneasily at Holmes, who listened with that detached serenity which so often disarmed the most agitated client. Lady Eleanor is no credulous woman, he continued. She is courageous, steadfast, and accustomed to solitude. Yet even she admits to a growing terror, as though the tower itself were exerting a malignant influence over her house. I could not but feel a shiver, for the picture he painted was one steeped in the Gothic horrors that the rational mind disdains, yet which stir deeply the imagination. Holmes, however, betrayed nothing save a quiet interest, his long fingers steepled before him. "Pray proceed, Mr. Fenton," he murmured, "for it is upon detail, however small, that truth depends." "Our first alarm," Mr. Fenton resumed, "came with the disappearance of Thomas Briggs, a footman in Lady Eleanor's employ. He was last seen crossing the courtyard at dusk, bearing a lantern. When morning came, neither he nor the light was found, though the wind carried whispers that he had been seized by the tower's curse." He drew a folded paper from his coat and placed it upon Holmes's knee. Shortly thereafter, Lady Eleanor received this letter. It bears no signature, yet its words are unmistakable in their menace. It warns her that unless she abandon the estate, Misfortune more terrible than death shall befall her. Holmes unfolded the paper, holding it to the light of the fire. His keen eyes traced the lines with practiced swiftness. I, leaning forward, observed nothing beyond an ill-formed scrawl, written in so heavy a hand as to appear almost engraved upon the page. "And the household?" Holmes asked. "Panic grows daily," replied the solicitor. "Already 2 servants have begged dismissal, while the villagers refuse to approach the tower after nightfall. Lady Eleanor, though outwardly calm, is harrowed by these occurrences. I fear that unless relief be swift, she may succumb to the terror that surrounds her." Holmes held the letter before him for a long moment, then placed it gently upon the table. A faint smile touched his lips, though his eyes gleamed with that peculiar light which heralded the awakening of his faculties. "The ink," he said softly. "Observe, Watson, its curious tint. Neither wholly black nor blue. Such a shade is produced by but a few manufacturers, and the handwriting, though disguised, reveals the tremor of a practiced yet agitated pen." He leaned back, the tips of his fingers pressed together. Turning to Mr. Fenton, Holmes inclined his head. "You have done wisely to come. Convey to Lady Eleanor that her cause is not abandoned to phantoms. I think we shall shortly make the acquaintance of the other," a sure sign that his thought was deep and rapid. I endeavoured to distract our nervous companion with conversation, but Fenton answered in monosyllables, his mind plainly preoccupied. When I at last desisted, we travelled for some time in silence, broken only by the rhythmic clatter of the wheels. At length Holmes spoke, his tone quiet but decisive. "The presence of a rare ink, Watson, is not to be overlooked. It is often by such trifles that truth may be grasped." Then he sank once more into contemplation, while Fenton's face grew paler at the reminder of the strange and menacing letter that had brought him to us. As the train carried us into the eastern counties, the scene beyond the windows grew more desolate with each passing mile. The hedgerows dwindled into stunted lines, the fields stretched barren beneath a lowering sky, and the salt tang of the distant sea drifted faintly upon the wind. It seemed to me that the very atmosphere grew heavier, as though the land itself carried the burden of some long-forgotten sorrow. At last the carriage drew near to a coastal plain, and there, outlined starkly against the pallor of the horizon, I beheld the object of our inquiry. The black tower rose in solitary grandeur above the waves, its massive stones darkened by centuries of storm and spray. A ruin it might be, yet it dominated the scene with an authority more dreadful than any stately mansion. Its battlements, jagged and broken, resembled the teeth of some monstrous creature, while gulls wheeled above, as though reluctant to alight upon its walls. I confess that a chill stole over me as I gazed upon it. Tales of hauntings and curses might find fertile ground in such a setting, and I could well imagine how weaker spirits might succumb to terror. Holmes, however, regarded the tower with a gaze devoid of superstition. "A fortress built to hold men in fear," he remarked quietly. "Still exert." We were met at the station by a carriage from Dracott Hall, and in due course conveyed along a winding road to the house itself. It stood but a short distance from the tower, whose shadow seemed to fall even upon its windows. The hall was of Elizabethan design, handsome yet severe, with narrow casements and tall chimneys rising against the sky. Within, we were ushered at once into a chamber where Lady Eleanor awaited us. She rose as we entered, and I was struck by the dignity of her bearing. Though clad in mourning black, she carried herself with a quiet grace, her features pale but resolute. There was a proud carriage in her head, yet her eyes, dark and luminous, betrayed an unrest that no composure could wholly conceal. "Mr. Holmes," she said, inclining her head slightly, "you do me great service in attending my cause. I fear, however, that even your renowned abilities may find themselves thwarted by powers which mock the wisdom of men." Holmes bowed. "Madam, I have yet to meet a phantom whose footprints I could not trace, nor a curse that bore no human hand behind it. If you will entrust me with the particulars, I shall give you my utmost." She sighed, her hands tightening upon the chair before her. "Then I must confess, sir, that I believe some agency, whether of this world or beyond, strives to drive me from my home. It is as though unseen forces are bent upon my destruction." Her words fell with the weight of conviction, and though I pitied her suffering, I could not help but feel anew the oppressive presence of the Black Tower looming ever at her gates. At Lady Eleanor's request, we were soon conducted across the grounds to the tower itself. A narrow path wound through tangled grass, until the ruin loomed before us in all its forbidding grandeur. The air seemed colder in its shadow, and I could not repress a shudder as we approached the blackened stones, which bore the scars of age and tempest alike. It was Holmes who first directed attention.
Low exclamation. "You see, gentlemen," she said, her voice trembling, "that the tower is not empty. Something, someone, seeks to make it his haunt." Her words, spoken against the moan of the sea, echoed with a dread I could not wholly banish from my mind. While Lady Eleanor and Mr. Fenton exchanged anxious words, Holmes remained curiously silent. He paced about the ruin with the air of a man communing with his own thoughts, pausing now and again to draw a finger along the stone, to stoop over some minute speck upon the ground, or to cast a swift glance at the cliffs where the waves broke ceaselessly below. To me, the footprints and the wax were sufficient proof that human agency lay behind the disturbances. Yet Holmes's expression told me that he perceived far more than I could discern. His eyes lingered upon the lock, upon the angle of the prints, and upon certain scratches in the stone, as though each whispered some hidden message intelligible only to him. When at last he rejoined us, he made no comment upon his discoveries, but merely remarked that we had best return to the hall before dusk. There was in his manner a restrained excitement which I had often noted when some promising clue had presented itself. I knew then that, however obscure the matter appeared to me, Holmes already saw beyond the veil of superstition and fear. It was soon after our return to the hall that we made the acquaintance of Captain Hugh Dracott, stepson of Lady Eleanor. He entered the chamber with the erect bearing of a soldier, yet his countenance betrayed a haughtiness that was far from pleasing. His dark eyes rested upon us with a suspicion scarcely veiled, and when he bowed to his stepmother, it was with a courtesy more formal than affectionate. "Mr. Holmes," said Lady Eleanor, "this is my husband's son, Hugh. He has but lately returned from service abroad." The captain inclined his head. "I had not expected," he said coldly, "to find my family affairs the subject of investigation in Baker Street." Holmes smiled with his usual composure. "Family affairs, Captain, may sometimes be interwoven with larger designs. We are but seekers after truth, and truth, I believe, serves all." The young man's lips tightened. "Truth, perhaps. Yet I cannot disguise my opinion that much ado is being made over the fancies of servants and the idle gossip of villagers. A crumbling ruin, however gloomy, cannot threaten a house such as ours." Despite his words, I noted the flush that rose to his cheek when inheritance was mentioned, and the swift glance he cast at Lady Eleanor, who bore his demeanour with quiet dignity. Holmes's gaze lingered on him for but a moment, yet I knew that behind those grey eyes every gesture and inflection was being weighed. When the captain had withdrawn, Holmes turned to me with that faint, unreadable smile which always set my curiosity aflame. Later that same afternoon, we were visited by Reverend Silas Kendrew, the parish vicar. He was a man of austere figure, his thin frame draped in sombre black, his face long and pale, with eyes that glowed with a fervour bordering on fanaticism. From the first moment, I felt that here was no ordinary clergyman.
but one whose mind was consumed by a singular obsession. He spoke little of the parish or of his flock, but much of the tower. "It is cursed ground," said he, lowering his voice. "The walls are steeped in the cries of the condemned. The very stones breathe malice. Many a soul has been lost within. And mark me, more shall follow if the place be not abandoned." Holmes, seated by the fire, regarded him steadily. "And yet, Reverend, curses do not set locks upon doors, nor do they scatter candle wax upon thresholds. You speak of spectres, but I perceive rather the hand of man." The vicar's face darkened, and he read, "One of your fellow servants has lately disappeared." At this her face grew troubled. "Aye, sir, Thomas Briggs. A faithful lad, or so I thought. He left at dusk one evening, and from that hour to this no word has come. Some whisper that the tower took him, and others that he fled in fear. For my part, I cannot say." "Did he bear any quarrel with Lady Eleanor or with the captain?" Holmes inquired. She hesitated, wringing her hands upon her apron. "No quarrel, sir, none that I knew. Yet—" She checked herself abruptly, her eyes darting toward her mistress, who had entered the room at that moment. "Yet he was restless of late, and easily startled." Holmes inclined his head, asking no more, but when she had gone, I remarked upon her evasiveness. He merely replied, "Loyalty, Watson, when pressed too far, becomes the cloak of fear. We must not overlook what lies unspoken. Among the guests then staying in the neighbourhood was Mr. Harold Merrow, a young scholar from Cambridge, who had sought permission to examine the tower for purposes of academic research. He was introduced to us in the library, a slight man with a high brow, spectacles perched precariously upon his nose, and fingers stained with ink. His manner was courteous, even deferential, yet beneath his eagerness I sensed a certain nervous reserve. "I am engaged upon a study of medieval architecture," he explained, "and the Black Tower, though ruinous, offers features of remarkable antiquity. Its masonry bears witness to Norman skill, and the carvings upon its arches are rare indeed." Holmes regarded him keenly. "You have spent some hours, I presume, within the ruin?" "Only in daylight, sir," Merrow replied quickly, almost too quickly. "The villagers would scarce accompany me at dusk, and I confess that I am not bold enough to linger there alone." As he spoke, I noted how his eyes flickered toward Lady Eleanor, and how his hands trembled slightly when mention was made of the missing servant. He knew more, I felt certain, than he cared to admit. Yet Holmes asked no further questions, merely bowing with a politeness that concealed his scrutiny. When Merrow had withdrawn, I ventured to express my suspicion. Holmes, however, only smiled faintly. "The scholar's shadow, Watson, may be longer than the tower itself. We must not dismiss him lightly." It was upon the second night of our stay that events assumed a more sinister complexion. Shortly after midnight, I was roused from uneasy slumber by a low cry. Hurrying to the window, I perceived a wavering light moving across the lawn toward the tower. The outline of a figure, dark and indistinct, glided in its glow, vanishing suddenly, as though swallowed by the stones themselves. Scarcely had I turned when the deep clang of a bell reverberated through the air. It came, unmistakably, from the tower, though no hand was near to sound it. The solemn note rolled over the grounds, setting every nerve within me quivering. I met Holmes upon the stair, his expression calm but intent, as he beckoned me wordlessly to follow. Together we made our way to the servants' quarters, where a fresh alarm had arisen. Lady Eleanor's maid lay senseless upon the floor, a scrap of linen clutched in her hand. When revived, she declared that she had discovered it upon her pillow, a cloth streaked with what appeared to be blood. The household was thrown into tumult. Servants whispered prayers, and even Lady Eleanor turned pale as death. Holmes examined the fragment with his lantern, holding it at various angles. "Curious," he muttered. "Very curious." Yet when I pressed him, he offered no explanation, merely pocketing the cloth as though it were of great significance. The night's disturbances left me shaken, for never had I encountered manifestations so uncanny. The bells tolling, the vanishing figure, the blooded cloth, all seemed what he termed old wives' tales, declared his intention of walking the grounds and passing beneath the shadow of the tower. Lady Eleanor implored him to desist, but he laughed at her fears and strode boldly toward the ruin, his step firm and defiant. Holmes and I, observing from a distance, had scarcely followed him to the base when the air was rent by a crash above our heads. With a cry, I drew Hugh back, for a mass of stone had fallen from the battlements, striking the earth with force enough to have killed him outright had he not stepped aside at that instant. Dust rose about us, and fragments of shattered rock lay scattered on the ground. For a moment, the young officer's proud bearing deserted him, and his face grew pale as he surveyed the ruin. "You see," cried Lady Eleanor, who had hurried to the spot, "the curse of the tower will not be denied." Holmes bent calmly to examine the fallen masonry. "The mortar is loosened by no natural decay," said he quietly. "Observe, Watson, the fresh marks where hands have prized these stones away. Chance has little share in such design." Captain Hugh muttered something about accidents and ill luck, but I could see that his defiance was shaken. For my part, the thought that some malignant agency lurked within those grim walls struck me with a foreboding I could not dispel. The incident spread quickly among the villagers, who soon gathered in anxious knots upon the lanes. Tales passed from mouth to mouth with growing exaggeration, until it was firmly believed that the tower had demanded a victim, and failing in its attempt upon Captain Hugh, would next claim Lady Eleanor herself. We heard these rumours from Mr. Fenton, who returned late that evening with a troubled countenance. "The people say the Dracott line is doomed," he told us. "Already some whisper that Lady Eleanor will not live to see the month's end. They speak of shadows moving upon the walls, of a phantom bell that tolls without cause, and of the vanished servant who was the tower's first prey." Holmes listened without expression, his long fingers interlaced, his gaze fixed upon the fire. "Superstition," he said at last, "is but fear seeking form. Yet when men tremble at phantoms, it is often because another hand has shown them where to look." Though his words were confident, the growing tension in the hall was undeniable. Even I, who had stood by Holmes through many strange adventures, could not wholly shake the dread that the ruin cast upon the place. At Holmes's request, we rose before the sun, and together we made our way toward the tower while the mist still clung to the fields. The ruin loomed above us in the grey light, and its silence was broken only by the moan of the sea. Holmes proceeded with his usual methodical care, beginning at the fallen stones, and working outward in a widening circle. He measured the depth of the footprints about the battlements, noting their direction and relative freshness. One set, broader than the rest, led toward the cliffs, where the soil crumbled steeply to the waves below. He stooped to collect a pinch of earth, holding it in his envelope book with as much attention as though it were gold dust. Within the tower itself, he examined the walls minutely, his lantern throwing long shadows upon the ancient stone. I observed him pause at the stairway, where faint scratches marked the surface, as though some object had been dragged with deliberate care. When at last he rejoined me at the entrance, his eyes gleamed with that quiet satisfaction which bespoke discovery. "We have sufficient, Watson," said he. "The tower speaks plainly, if only one will listen, but the language is not of spirits, but of men who play at being spirits." His words steadied me, though I could not pretend to comprehend the full significance of what he had discerned. Still, I knew by the light in his eye that the path of reason was already leading him toward the truth. Holmes lingered long about the ruin after his initial survey. Collecting from the soil near the cliff, a sec preserved his habitual reticence. The silence in which he pursued his inquiries weighed upon me more heavily than speech, for it left the imagination free to conjure terrors of its own. That day passed, with Holmes engaged in his customary labours, while I, Left largely to my own reflections, grew increasingly restless. The household whispered of curses, and every shadow seemed fraught with menace. Yet Holmes, though clearly advancing towards some conclusion, vouchsafed me nothing beyond the most casual remarks. I could see that the chain of his deductions was lengthening, each link forged from details invisible to my untrained eye. His calm demeanour, far from easing my mind, served only to heighten my perplexity. What connection lay between soil, wax, ink, and crumbling stone? Why should he handle each with such precision, and yet refuse to disclose his reasoning? At last, unable to contain myself, I ventured a question. Holmes merely smiled faintly, placing his hand upon my shoulder. "Patience, Watson. The truth must be drawn gently, like a fish upon the line. To strike too soon is to lose all." His words, though kindly meant, left me no less uneasy. It was toward evening that Holmes requested a private audience with Mr. Fenton. I accompanied him as far as the library, but there he bade me wait, for the matter, he said, was one of legal intricacy. From within, I caught only the murmur of voices, Fenton's low and troubled, Holmes's measured and deliberate. When at last he emerged, his expression bore that peculiar gravity which I had come to associate with cases of human greed and ambition, rather than of spectral fancy. "Watson," said he, "our mystery is less one of phantoms than of parchment. The tower is but the stage. The inheritance is the drama. We must watch closely, for the play is near its climax." With that enigmatic declaration, he retired to his chamber, leaving me to ponder in growing bewilderment the dark secret that hung over the Black Tower. It was upon the evening after his consultation with Mr. Fenton that Holmes at last condescended to speak more openly of his thoughts. We sat together in the library, the candles burning low, when he turned to me with that half-quizzical expression which heralded instruction. "You are impressed, Watson," said he, "by the phantom lights, the tolling bell, and the sinister history that clings about yonder ruin. Yet what do all these manifestations share?" "They are inexplicable," I replied. "No mortal hand seems equal to them." "On the contrary," he rejoined, "it is precisely the mark of mortal hands that I see in each. Consider, the lights appear only where they may be observed from the hall. The bell tolls when the household is most likely to be awake, and the servant's disappearance comes at the height of alarm. Chance? No, Watson. It is orchestration. Every note struck to rouse fear, every detail arranged to sustain the illusion of a curse." His words, spoken with quiet conviction, pierced the fog of superstition that had clouded my own mind. Still, I could not wholly dismiss the uncanny impression the tower had made upon me. Holmes smiled at my hesitation. "The Gothic, my dear fellow, is but the stage upon which the drama of avarice and ambition is played. Strip away the trappings, and we shall see the actor behind the mask." The following morning, Holmes conducted me once more to the tower. With the aid of his lantern and certain small mirrors which he had procured, he set about demonstrating the artifice by which the ruin had been made to blaze with spectral light. "Observe," said he, adjusting a mirror at a cunning angle within a narrow embrasure. The beam, reflected against the wall, produced a wavering glow that seemed to dance upon the stones as though of supernatural origin. By shifting the mirror slightly, he caused the light to lengthen, calculating intelligence bent upon terror. From the lights, Holmes turned to the matter of the bell, whose tolling had chilled the blood of all who heard it. Leading me up the narrow stair, he pointed to a beam in the rafters, where a thin wire had been affixed with care. Following its course, we discovered that it ran down the wall, and thence out through a crevice toward the ground below. "With this contrivance," said Holmes, tugging gently at the wire, "our ingenious opponent has contrived to set the bell in motion from without. A pull at the cord and the clapper strikes. No hand need be seen within. To the imagination already inflamed, the sound is not of rope and iron, but of doom itself. The simplicity of the device astounded me. I could scarcely credit that a mechanism so slight had produced an impression so dreadful. Holmes, however, treated it as the most natural of discoveries. "It is always thus," he remarked. "The world is content to believe in ghosts when a piece of wire suffices. Remember it well, Watson. The extraordinary is often but the ordinary, perceived through the lens of fear." He replaced the wire and descended, his expression one of grim satisfaction. For my own part, the tower seemed less a dwelling of spirits than a snare set for human prey, a snare into which Lady Eleanor was plainly meant to fall. Our next inquiry carried us to the vicarage, where Reverend Kendrew received us with his usual mixture of courtesy and solemnity. The house was austere, its shelves lined with volumes of theology and medieval chronicles. Yet Holmes's gaze travelled past these to the writing desk that stood near the window. With a politeness that brooked no refusal, Holmes requested permission to examine the study. The vicar, though somewhat reluctant, could scarce object, and my companion lost no time in his inspection. Upon the desk stood an inkwell of curious appearance. Holmes dipped his pen lightly, then produced from his pocket the anonymous letter which had so alarmed Lady Eleanor. Placing a sample upon a scrap of blotting paper, he compared the hues with meticulous care. "Remarkable," said he at last. "The tint is identical, a rare manufacture, partaking neither wholly of black nor blue, but of a peculiar violet sheen. It is not commonly to be found in provincial shops." Kendrew's face betrayed no emotion, yet I fancied a shadow passed across his features. He murmured something of scholarly correspondence, but Holmes, with a bland smile, laid aside the papers and thanked him for his courtesy. As we quitted the vicarage, I could not repress my excitement. "Surely, Holmes," I exclaimed, "this proves the authorship beyond dispute." "Proves," he echoed, with a slight raising of the brows. "It suggests, Watson, nothing more. The most damning evidence may sometimes be the easiest planted. Let us not run before we can walk." His calm restraint left me more perplexed than ever. For my own part, I was convinced that we had unmasked our man. The Reverend's fervid warnings, his morbid obsession with the tower, and now the presence of ink identical to that used in the threatening letter, all seemed to point with unerring certainty to his guilt. Who else, I argued hotly, as we returned to the hall, would labour so persistently to drive Lady Eleanor from her home? Who else speaks of curses and gloats over doom, while contriving devices of wire and mirror to sustain the terror? Holmes regarded me with indulgent amusement. "Your case is well constructed, Watson, but you have overlooked the essential point." "And what is that?" "That motive must be proportionate to means. Our friend the vicar possesses zeal enough, but does zeal explain ambition?" I pressed him to explain, but he shook his head. "Not yet. The net must be woven with care, else the quarry escape. I've seen enough to convince me that the true issue lies not in the tower's ghostly aspect, but in parchment and property. The inheritance of the Dracott line, Watson, that is the key to this riddle." His words fell with solemn weight, and I confess that a chill ran through me at the thought that all these ghastly occurrences might spring not from spirits of the dead, but from the cold design of the living. It was upon the third evening of our sojourn that Holmes revealed his design. "The time has come, Watson," said he, "to strip away pretense and lay bare the hand that has sought to weave terror out of shadows. But we must be present at the very moment when our adversary moves, else all will remain conjecture." Accordingly, he secured the cooperation of the local constable and 2 trustworthy men, instructing them with a precision that admitted no doubt of his forethought. Lady Eleanor was persuaded to retire early, though she trembled at the notion of leaving her fate in unseen hands. Captain Hugh muttered against the scheme, but Holmes silenced him with a glance. Under cover of darkness, we took our posts within the tower itself. Holmes stationed the constables in a recess near the stair, while I was directed to remain at his side behind a crumbling arch. He himself kept to the shadows opposite the entrance, his figure scarcely distinguishable from the stone. "Stillness, Watson," he whispered. "The enemy relies upon fear. Let us give him silence in which to betray himself." Thus arrayed, we waited in the gloom, the cold stones pressing against us, the air thick with damp. My heart beat more heavily than I cared to confess, for the tower, in its nocturnal solitude, seemed a place where centuries of suffering still clung. Yet Holmes was calm, his eyes gleaming faintly in the dark, his every sense attuned to the coming drama.
Never shall I forget the hours we passed in that desolate watch. The sea boomed dully against the cliffs, and each gust of wind sent a mournful sigh through the broken apertures of the ruin. The stones themselves seemed to groan, as though the weight of their history pressed still upon them. The constables stirred uneasily in their concealment, and I confess that more than once I started at the imagined rustle of a cloak or the phantom tread of unseen feet. The silence grew suffocating, broken only by the drip of moisture from the vaulting above. Time crept forward with merciless slowness, and I envied Holmes his immobility, for he crouched as motionless as a statue. More than once I thought I discerned a faint glimmer upon his face, but it was only the reflection of my own nervousness, mirrored in his composure. At length, a sound reached us that was no trick of fancy, a faint creak, as of wood disturbed. Holmes's hand touched my arm with the lightness of a feather, bidding me attend. From beyond the stair there came the scrape of iron against stone, followed by the soft glow of a lantern. Its light filtered through some covering. My breath caught, and I felt a chill such as no winter wind could give. Holmes leaned close and whispered, "Courage, Watson. The play is about to begin." The light grew stronger, and with it there emerged from the stair a figure so uncanny that for a moment my reason faltered. Cloaked and hooded, it moved with deliberate tread, bearing in one hand the lantern whose flame wavered like some unholy fire. In the other hand it carried a coil of rope. The apparition paused at the centre of the chamber, then turned toward the battlements. There, with solemn gestures, it fastened the rope as though preparing for some ghastly rite. In that instant, the full horror of its design burst upon me. The spectre meant to simulate Lady Eleanor's self-destruction, casting her as the tower's next victim, her supposed despair completing the legend of the curse. A gasp rose to my lips, but broken only by the rushing of the wind through the ruin. I confess that I felt a shudder as the truth struck home, that this minister of religion, who had so often thundered of curses and damnation, should himself assume the mask of spectre, was almost beyond belief. Yet his eyes glared with a wild light, and his lips trembled with the fury of one unmasked. Holmes regarded him with cold disdain. "So, Reverend," said he, "the ghost has substance after all. You have preached your curse too long, and now we perceive the hand that rang the bell, lit the lights, and strewed terror in every corner of this house. The tower is haunted indeed, but by your devices." Kendrew's mouth twisted in a bitter smile, but he spoke no word, standing rigid in Holmes's grasp. Lady Eleanor's name upon the rope and the lantern in his hand told more plainly than speech the dreadful fate he had intended for her. At length Kendrew found his voice, and it rang through the chamber with the fervour of a zealot. "You call me criminal," he cried, "but I am the guardian of sacred ground. That tower was consecrated by blood long before Lady Eleanor or her line laid claim to these lands. The Church's right has been usurped, its heritage mocked, and I, yes, I alone, was chosen to restore it." She would not leave, though the spirits warned her. Then it was for me to become the spirit she would obey. His words tumbled forth in a torrent, half confession, half sermon. He spoke of parchments that proved the tower had once been church property, of vows sworn by monks long dead, of ancient rites that demanded solitude around the ruin. To him, Lady Eleanor was not a widow defending her inheritance,
but an intruder profaning holy soil. Holmes listened with folded arms, his gaze never wavering. "Fanaticism, Watson," he murmured to me, "is the most dangerous of motives, for it cloaks itself in righteousness. Yet beneath the cassock lies the same hand that bribes servants, loosens stones, and writes letters steeped in menace. The sacred is but the mask of the profane." Kendrew's eyes blazed as he struggled in his captor's hold. "You speak as men of this age," he shouted, "but I stand with centuries of faith behind me." His voice broke into wild laughter that echoed unnervingly through the stones. Suddenly, with the strength of desperation, Kendrew wrenched himself free and dashed toward the stair. The constables stumbled in pursuit, but he turned savagely, seizing one by the throat and hurling him against the wall. His face, contorted with frenzy, bore little trace of the solemn clergyman we had first encountered. Holmes darted forward, striking his arm aside as he raised the lantern in an effort to blind his pursuers. The glass shattered upon the floor, and for an instant, sparks flared dangerously in the gloom. With a cry, I flung myself into the struggle, and between us we bore him down. It took all the strength of 3 men to master him, so violent were his contortions. At last, the irons were fastened upon his wrists, and he lay panting, subdued but unrepentant, upon the cold stones of the tower he had haunted. Holmes straightened his coat, his face grave yet composed. "The curse of the Black Tower," said he quietly, "is lifted, not by exorcism, but by handcuffs." It was some days later that Holmes and I found ourselves once more in our familiar quarters at Baker Street. How strange appeared the tranquil streets of London after the gloom and terror of the Norfolk coast. The rattle of carriages, the cries of the newsboys, and the warm glow of the fire in our sitting room contrasted so vividly with the moaning sea, the ruined battlements, and the haunted aspect of the tower, that I might have believed.
Letter that had first reached Lady Eleanor. "Consider, Watson," said he, "the ink. You may recall how its hue struck me at the outset as peculiar, neither black nor blue but with a violet tinge. That observation alone was enough to suggest rarity. When, in the vicar's study, I encountered an inkwell of identical tint, the coincidence was too marked to ignore. But might it not have been procured elsewhere? I objected. Doubtless, had one searched London. Yet Norfolk is not London, and such ink is no common article in a country parish. Add to this the tremor in the hand that penned it, precisely the same tremor I noted in Kendrew's writing upon the church registers. Thus, the letter which threatened Lady Eleanor was, in truth, but the Reverend's sermon in another form. Words of doom meant to awe where preaching failed. I recalled the fervid tones with which Kendrew had spoken of curses, and the dreadful emphasis with which he had urged Lady Eleanor's departure. Seen in this light, the letter was no ghostly warning, but the first deliberate step in a campaign of terror. Holmes replaced the paper in his desk. So much for the ink. Once you strip the supernatural from the tale, the ink is the ghost that left its footprints upon the page. Holmes next turned his discourse to the incident of the falling masonry. "You will remember, Watson," said he, "the stones that all but crushed Captain Hugh. To the fearful mind it seemed the work of fate, but to my eye, the marks of deliberate tampering were as plain as if chiselled in the mortar. The cement that bound those blocks had been prized away by hand, the edges fresh and sharp where the tool had bitten. That the fall occurred at the very instant the captain passed beneath was no accident. It was an attempt at murder, veiled beneath the guise of supernatural vengeance." "Then Hugh was indeed the intended victim?" I asked. "Undoubtedly. His presence complicated the inheritance. Remove him, and Lady Eleanor, terrified, might be driven to flight, or worse, compelled to yield her rights. In either case, the land passed beyond her grasp. You see, Watson, how carefully ambition dresses itself in the robes of the uncanny. The stone that falls from the battlement may seem the hand of doom, yet it is only the hand of man with a crowbar." I shuddered to think how near death the proud young officer had come. Holmes's calm recital, delivered in that measured tone of his, made me realize anew how perilously thin had been the veil between superstition and crime. Holmes next addressed the mystery of the vanished footman. Thomas Briggs,
said he, was no victim of spectral hands, but of bribery. The lad was offered money to quit his post abruptly and to vanish so completely that his absence might feed the rumour of the tower's appetite for souls. He was spirited away to Norwich, where he lay hidden in a lodging-house, until I traced him by means of a few discreet inquiries. The poor fellow, half frightened out of his wits, confessed readily enough, once assured that he faced no charge. I exclaimed at this revelation. Then the stories of his being swallowed by the tower. Idle inventions, Watson, encouraged by our adversary to deepen the climate of fear. Each disappearance, each whisper of doom, was part of the carefully staged illusion. Briggs's absence was but another turn of the screw, meant to sap Lady Eleanor's courage and undermine the loyalty of her household. I could not but marvel at the cunning of a mind that would stoop to such devices, weaving dread from so trifling a cause as a servant's dismissal. Holmes, however, dismissed it with a wave of the hand. Terror, Watson, is most effective when it begins with the ordinary. Holmes then produced from his drawer the scrap of linen which had caused such consternation when discovered upon the maid's pillow. "Observe," said he, "the stain. At first sight it appears blood, and indeed it was meant to be accepted as such, but doubly vile." Holmes, however, remained imperturbable, his gaze fixed upon the fragment as though it were a puzzle already solved. Holmes leaned back in his chair, the ghost of a smile upon his lips. "You see, Watson, how superstition serves as a cloak beneath which cold ambition hides its face. Men are ever ready to believe in phantoms, but it is the hand of their neighbour they should most fear. Reverend Kendrew cloaked greed and fanaticism in the garb of piety, and found in ghostly legends a ready instrument of terror. The world, I think, has less to dread from the shades of the departed than from those who conjure such shades for their own designs." His words, spoken in the calm of Baker Street, seemed to cast a final light upon the darkness of the Black Tower. Thus ended the affair of the Black Tower, one of the most sombre in my recollection. The ruin stands still upon the Norfolk cliffs, but no villager now whispers of curses, for the spectre that haunted it has been revealed as mortal after all. I could not but marvel at my friend's unfailing reason, which pierced through the veil of terror to the naked truth. Yet I carried away also a deeper sadness, that faith, once warped by fanaticism, may wreak greater harm than any phantom of the night. Such is the frailty and the peril of the human mind. Holmes leaned back in his chair, the firelight glinting upon his sharp profile, and regarded me with quiet gravity. "You see, Watson, there was never a phantom in the Black Tower, only the all-too-human spectre of fanaticism, cloaking greed in the garments of superstition. The dead trouble us little. It is the living, when blinded by obsession, who weave the most dreadful curses. And now, dear listener, a question for you. What do you think was Reverend Kendrew's gravest mistake? His reliance on fear, or his belief that his cause justified every deceit? If you enjoyed this mystery,